Today we're going to be talking about The Last of Us 2, the narrative structure, and how to manipulate your audience. So when The Last of Us 2 first came out, one of the biggest complaints from a lot of users was that they felt the story was trying to manipulate them into feeling a certain way about a character. I don't even want to get into this because that's the whole point of storytelling, is to manipulate your audience into feeling a certain way about your characters or about your story, about your narrative. But The Last of Us does this. The Last of Us 2 specifically does this through the narrative structure of the game. The main way that they manipulate you is the way that they set up the narrative. So I just want to break it down for us right now because it's fucking genius. So the core story of the game, the core message of The Last of Us 2 is about violence, cycles of violence, seeking revenge, and the cost of seeking revenge. We see through the narrative what seeking revenge does to the characters, perpetuating this cycle of violence and then finally breaking it, and what that does for our two main characters, Ellie and Abby, in the narrative. And the way that the game does this is by showing us through the narrative. The narrative is broken into two separate narratives for each character. The first half of the game we play through Ellie's perspective, the second half of the game we play through Abby's perspective, and in the end we go back to Ellie's perspective after having seen all of Abby's perspective. So the way the game does this is through a very non-conventional means of narrative structure. Most of us are used to the little triangle that we see when you're taught narrative structure in your English class. You're usually shown this triangle. It starts with the exposition. Usually there's an inciting incident. We go into the rising action. We hit the climax. There's a small falling action, and then we have the resolution at the end of the narrative. This game does not follow this structure. If anything, the game is this structure twice in a row with a little plateau at the end. And this isn't to say that this is a bad structure. I think that we conventionally know that this structure, the original conventional way of doing things, is the way that we see in most media, because it is an effective way of telling a story and an effective way of affecting the viewer. But it's not the only way to tell story, and anyone who studies literature would know this, because you know that it's not the only way to tell a story. And in some cases, the most powerful narratives that I've read are stories that don't follow this structure at all. So the structure of the game allows us more effectively to understand the message of the game. If we only see the game from one perspective, Ellie's perspective, we have a skewed and biased perspective. We won't get the message that we need to at the end of the story. It's implicit that we need to understand Abby's side of the story to understand the whole meaning of this game. After playing The Last of Us 1, we're attached to Ellie and Joel as characters. That's why the game obviously starts from the perspective of Ellie. Joel's death is the inciting incident of the narrative and the reason and driving force of the whole game. When we play as Ellie in the beginning of the game, we're supposed to mirror her feelings. There's a reason that the scenes are framed the way they are, the reason that we're only given bits and pieces of information, because we're playing Ellie, we're supposed to be from Ellie's perspective. There's a reason why when we're in the room at the lodge, we don't hear the conversation that everyone else is having, and then only later when we're playing from Abby's perspective do we finally see that, because now we're seeing the full picture, the whole story, not just what Ellie is seeing as the character. And the whole setup of the game is to make the viewer feel the same way Ellie does. When Joel dies, we're supposed to feel the same anger that Ellie does. It's the driving force to make us want to go out into this world, find the people who did it, and kill them as revenge for what they've done to Joel. We played the whole first game with Joel. Anyone who's played the first game, almost anyone who's played the first game, is overly attached to Joel. And the thought of him dying is awful. It's a lot of grief for both the viewer and for Ellie to withstand, and it's the reason that Ellie goes out. Most players playing this feel the same way Ellie does. They want to go out, they want to get revenge for Joel dying. They don't see anything past this because they're angered by the fact that he died and so brutally killed. The game is implicitly taking advantage of the fact that they know you'll empathize with Ellie and her story because you've played the first game. They're taking advantage of the viewer's feelings and the viewer's relationship to the story to tell the message that they really want to send. So yeah, it's manipulative, but there's a reason why it's manipulative. So in the first half of the game, you play Ellie's narrative. You see Ellie's feelings, what she's going through. We see her side of the story. We don't understand anything about Abby. Abby is nothing but a distant threat and something to kill, basically, at the end of the day. We see as Ellie moves through the narrative, she gets angrier and angrier as the narrative goes on, becomes desperate in finding Abby, and will sacrifice anything at any cost. We see this in the scene with Jesse and Ellie when Jesse wants to go after Tommy, and Ellie, consumed by her revenge, instead decides to go after Abby because she thinks Abby is still in the aquarium.
Talking about Tommy.
We don't know that.
Who else is it gonna be?
If it is him, he'll be gone by the time we get there. Abby is where he'll be headed, so if we just
What if he's in trouble?
He can take care of himself.
Jesus Christ.
The best way to help Tommy is to go after Abby. You do this, I'm not saving your ass again.
I really hope you make it.
Ellie's narrative is actually the most manipulative part of the narrative. We have to feel what Ellie's feeling for the story to have the impact that it does. We need to feel as angry as she does. We need to feel as guilty as she does. We need to feel the things that she feels so that we can have that driving force towards the rising action of the narrative and towards the climax of this story. Ellie's whole part of the story is about her coming to terms with the trauma that Joel's death has upon her. Abby's narrative in the game is necessary for us to understand the meaning of the game. The game does this by having the climax in the theater scene be the moment when we switch to Abby's perspective, even though the viewer might not and probably does not want to play as Abby in the story because you don't want to understand why she did the thing she did or justify the thing she did. The only way we can come to understand the story is by playing as Abby and understanding her motives. The switch at the climax in the theater scene is the driving force. If you're playing the game, you don't want to play as Abby. The only way to get the player to continue playing as Abby is to climax and cut off at a scene of high tension so that the player will want to progress through Abby's story so that they can understand what happens in that theater scene. The only way you know what happens at the end of the story is if you continue to play the game through Abby's perspective. So regardless of how you feel about Abby, to get a resolution to the story, you have to continue playing as her. Abby's narrative is kind of a foil for Ellie's narrative. At the beginning of the game, Abby sought revenge, got her revenge, and we see in her narrative how she is so consumed by this idea that she loses everything that means anything to her. Ellie is the consequences of her actions. Ellie is also seeking revenge, starting this cycle of violence. Abby has already gone through the cycle of violence and is still suffering from that. We see that in dream sequences. She's haunted by her past. It doesn't matter that she's killed Joel. It hasn't brought her peace. She's still seeing the ghosts of her past in her dreams. She's still unable to sleep. She still doesn't have any sense of peace like she thought she would. It's only when Abby meets Yara and Lev that the dreams begin to turn. We see them hanging up in the trees, and Abby feels an incentive to help them, which is turning her narrative on its head. This all, of course, comes to a head in the theater scene, wherein Abby, in the position of power, can take Ellie's life, but chooses not to because Lev asks her not to. In this moment, she's breaking the cycle of violence, stepping away from it, and not continuing to perpetuate the violence that Ellie wants to continue with. Abby's narrative at its core is teaching us the consequences of getting revenge. Abby loses everything in this narrative. She loses her standing in the WLF. She loses every single one of her friends. She loses anything that matters to her. And as sad as Ellie's loss of Joel is, it's really Abby that hurts in this story. It's really Abby that loses everything, and through the course of her narrative, we come to sympathize with her as a character. We come to understand why she did the thing she did. Had we not had the relationship with Joel and Ellie in the first game, Abby would probably be the one that we sympathize with more, because Abby's the one who had her father ruthlessly killed. Abby's the one who had to relocate her entire life. Abby's the one who lost all of her friends. Abby's the one who's lost everything. Ellie still has a foundation, a home, and her friends with Dina and Tommy and Maria and Jackson. She still has that foundation. Abby does not have that. At the end of the narrative, all she has is Lev. This is perhaps what makes the plateau ending of the game the most powerful section of the game. We've played through Ellie's narrative. We know how Ellie feels. We've played through Abby's narrative. We know how Abby feels. When we get the conflict at the end, wherein Ellie continues to perpetuate the cycle of violence, Ellie loses everything, as we see. She shows up in Santa Barbara really sickly, thin, not looking well. She's consumed by this need for revenge. The fight on the beach is supposed to be grueling. Abby has lost a ton of weight. She doesn't look like the same person that she was before. She's gone through all this trauma with Lev. All she cares about is saving Lev and leaving. Ellie, on the other hand, can't let go of the anger that she has. She needs to find revenge for Joel. She needs to have that closure to their relationship. Ellie, at the end of the narrative, chooses not to continue the cycle of violence. Even though she has the ability to continue, she has the ability to overcome, she chooses to stop. And it's not until the very end of the narrative, when she walks back to the abandoned, empty house outside of Jackson that she lived in with Dina, that we see the real reason as to why she started this whole venture in the first place. The reason why she's so overcome with guilt is that she's upset with herself that she couldn't forgive Joel before he died. When she chooses not to kill Abby on the beach, she's ending this cycle of violence, which we see when she returns home to Jackson. She's still wearing Dina's bracelet, suggesting that she has reestablished a relationship with Dina. Unlike Abby, she hasn't lost everything. Meanwhile, you have Abby's narrative, which begins to become a foil of the first game. We see that Abby is now like a new Joel. She's jaded, but she's found something that she can live for again, which is Lev.
Oh my god, she's gone. Come on. Those were your fucking people. You're my people.
The only way that the story is able to tell you all of this is by framing it in the way that it does. By having two separate narratives in the game, we're able to see both sides of the story, understand that there is not a protagonist and a villain, but two people trying to deal with the trauma of losing someone very close to them. And trauma is the driving force of this narrative. We see it through the moments that Ellie plays guitar. At the beginning, she can only play a little bit, but as the game goes on, she becomes closer to getting over her trauma. She can play more of the song. We see this in the ending scene in the house where she's playing the song and she finally leaves the guitar in the house. She walks off into the distance and we see her finally move past, or at least begin to start moving past, the trauma of losing Joel. Similarly, at the end, Abby is able to get to the Fireflies, moving past her trauma and moving on from the stage in her life. So yeah, maybe the game did manipulate you to feel a certain thing. But that's the whole point of storytelling. The whole richness of this story is from being manipulated, from taking you on a ride. Allowing yourself to be manipulated in stories like this allows the person telling you the story to really tell you the narrative and the messages of the game. If you don't allow yourself to be taken along with the ride, then you're missing out on everything in the game.